The Awakening of Myths. The observation deck of the Carillion research station hung in the darkness between stars, a silent witness to the void. Chief researcher Thane stood before the massive viewport, his 6 eyes fixed on the emptiness beyond. For 300 cycles, his people had monitored this sector of space, and for 300 cycles, they had found nothing but silence and shadows. Until today. The alert had come during the night shift, when most of the crew slept in their pods. A signal, faint but unmistakable, had pierced through the cosmic background noise. It was old, incredibly old, yet somehow still transmitting with perfect clarity. Thane had rushed to the communications array, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure what he would find. What he discovered changed everything. The signal was coded in a language that existed only in children's stories and ancient academic texts, a language that scholars insisted was purely mythological, created by primitive civilizations to explain the unexplainable. It was the language of the Terrans, the humans, the ghost species that supposedly vanished before the current galactic order even existed. Thane's hands trembled as he activated the translation protocol. The words that appeared on his screen made his blood run cold with a mixture of fear and wonder. It was a beacon, and it was calling someone home. Within hours, the signal had spread across the monitoring networks of a dozen civilizations. By the second day, every major power in the galaxy knew about it. The discovery sparked immediate chaos in the halls of power throughout civilized space. The Grand Assembly convened an emergency session on the neutral station of Axis Prime. Representatives from 43 different species gathered in the circular chamber, their voices rising in a cacophony of disbelief, excitement, and fear. The Vrexians, with their logical minds and preference for order, demanded empirical proof. The Zephani, whose long lives gave them access to ancient memories, whispered that the old warnings might be true. The Corthan Empire, always hungry for power, saw opportunity in the chaos. Ambassador Lyrix of the Carillion Confederation stood at the central podium, presenting Thane's findings to the Assembly. Holographic displays showed the signal's wave patterns, its mathematical precision, and most damning of all, its origin point. The beacon came from a dead world in a forgotten sector, a place that ancient star charts labeled simply as Sol System, Origin Point, Human. The chamber erupted in argument. Some delegates insisted it was a hoax, an elaborate trick by rivals seeking to destabilize the galactic order. Others believed it was real, but argued the humans must be long extinct, and the beacon was merely an automated ghost crying out to a species that would never answer. A few, the ones who had studied the old texts most carefully, sat in worried silence. Commander Varkas of the Corthan Warfleet stood, his massive frame casting a shadow across the chamber. His voice boomed with confidence and barely concealed aggression. If the humans were real, and if they possessed the technology legends attributed to them, then whoever found their artifacts first would dominate the galaxy. He proposed immediate military expeditions to the old human territories, claiming everything they found in the name of galactic security. The proposal was met with fierce opposition. The Solian Collective, beings of pure energy who valued peace above all else, argued that such aggression would doom them all. If humans were truly returning, greeting them with theft and military posturing would invite catastrophe. Better to wait, to prepare a peaceful welcome, to offer friendship rather than hostility. While the Assembly argued, Thane continued his work. He had assembled a team of linguists, historians, and cryptographers, all working frantically to decode the deeper layers of the human signal. What they found in the following days painted a picture that both amazed and terrified them. The beacon was not simply a distress call. It was a key, designed to activate other systems throughout the old human territories. As Thane's team tracked the signal's propagation, they watched as dormant facilities across 100 worlds suddenly came to life. Power cores that had been silent for 8 centuries began humming with energy. Defense satellites that had been dark for longer than most civilizations had existed started moving into active positions. Data repositories that held the accumulated knowledge of humanity began broadcasting their contents into space. It was as if an entire civilization had been sleeping, waiting for this moment to wake up. The most disturbing discovery came from a deep space monitoring station on the galactic rim. The automated sensors, designed to watch for threats from the intergalactic void, had detected something impossible. Movement. Massive movement. Thousands of objects, each one larger than any ship currently in service, were approaching from the darkness beyond the galaxy's edge. They were still far away, their exact nature obscured by distance and the interference of the void, but their trajectory was clear. They were heading toward the Milky Way, toward home, and they would arrive in approximately 30 standard days. The Grand Assembly recalled all delegates for an urgent session. The evidence was undeniable now. Humans were real. They had survived, and they were coming back. Panic spread through the chamber like wildfire. The Korthan Empire immediately began recalling their fleets, preparing for what they assumed would be an invasion. The Vrexian Logic Collective started calculating defensive strategies and running probability simulations, none of which offered encouraging results. The smaller civilizations looked to their stronger neighbors for protection, for guidance, for any reassurance that they would survive what was coming. Ambassador Lyrix called for calm, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos. She understood what the others were feeling. The legends of humanity were not gentle stories. They spoke of a species that could adapt to any environment, survive any hardship, and fight with a ferocity that bordered on madness. They told of humans who refused to surrender even when defeat was certain, who sacrificed everything for their companions, and who carried grudges across generations. There was one story in particular that haunted Lyrix's thoughts. It came from the Zephany archives, recorded by one of their ancestors who had supposedly met a human trader in the time before the Exodus. The human had been asked what made his species special, what allowed them to compete with civilizations that were stronger, faster, and lived longer. The human had smiled and said something that the Zephany never forgot. "We are persistence predators. We might not be the fastest or the strongest, but we never stop. We will chase you across continents, across worlds, across time itself, and eventually you will fall and we will still be coming." That night, as Lyrix stood in her quarters looking out at the stars, she wondered what 800 years in the void had done to a species like that. Had the hardships softened them, taught them peace and caution, or had it made them harder, more desperate, more dangerous? The monitoring stations continued their watch. Each day brought new data about the approaching fleet. The numbers grew more staggering with each report. Not thousands of ships, but tens of thousands. Not warships alone, but vessels of every conceivable design. Colony ships the size of moons. Factory vessels that could strip entire asteroids. Agricultural platforms that could feed billions. And yes, warships, sleek and deadly, moving in perfect formation at the fleet's edges like predators guarding their herd. Thane discovered something else in the beacon's code, hidden in layers of encryption that took his team weeks to crack. It was a message, recorded 800 years ago by the last humans to leave the Sol system. The voice was female, strong, despite the exhaustion that colored every word. She identified herself as Captain Alina Reeves, and she spoke directly to whoever would receive the message. The captain explained why they had left. Their son was dying, faster than anyone had predicted. They had perhaps 50 years before Earth became uninhabitable. Not enough time to save everyone through evacuation. Barely enough time to build a fleet capable of carrying a fraction of humanity to safety. They made the hardest choice imaginable. They would take everyone they could and venture beyond the galaxy, into the void where no one had ever explored, searching for new worlds capable of supporting human life. The captain's message ended with a promise and a warning. "We are leaving, but we are not giving up. We will find a way to survive. We will build new homes in the darkness. And one day, when we are strong enough, when we have found our new place in the universe, we will return. This is not goodbye. This is see you later." To whoever finds this message, know that humanity endures. We always endure. The recording sent chills through everyone who heard it. These were not conquerors returning to reclaim lost territory. These were survivors, coming home after an exile that should have killed them. What that meant for the current galactic order, no one could say. As the 29th day arrived, the Grand Assembly reached a decision. They would send an envoy to meet the human fleet at the galactic rim. Not a military force, but a diplomatic mission, carrying messages of welcome and hope for peaceful coexistence. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to shape first contact in a way that did not end in catastrophe. The envoy ship, named Hope's Beacon, departed from Axis Prime, carrying ambassadors from 12 different species. Thane was among them, his expertise in human culture making him invaluable to the mission. As their vessel crossed into the outer territories and approached the darkness beyond the rim, every member of the crew felt the weight of what they were doing. They were about to meet legends. They were about to discover what— The return of giants. The diplomatic vessel Hope's Beacon drifted in the empty space between the galaxy's rim and the approaching human fleet. Inside the ship, 12 ambassadors from different species waited in tense silence, each processing the magnitude of what they were about to do. They were the first beings in 800 years to make contact with humanity, and none of them knew if they would survive the encounter. Thane stood at the observation window, watching the human fleet grow larger with each passing moment. The ships were unlike anything he had ever seen. They bore the scars of centuries, hull plating that had been repaired and replaced countless times, weapon systems that looked both ancient and terrifyingly advanced. These were not pristine vessels fresh from shipyards. These were survivors, just like the people who crewed them. Ambassador Lyrics approached him, her diplomatic robes flowing in the ship's artificial gravity. Her voice was soft, almost reverent. She asked Thane what he thought the humans would be like after so long in the void. Would they still be the species from the legends? Or would exile have changed them into something unrecognizable? Thane considered the question carefully. He had spent years studying human culture, reading their literature, analyzing their history, trying to understand what made them unique among all the species that had ever existed. What he had learned both fascinated and frightened him. Humans were adaptable beyond measure, capable of thriving in environments that would kill most other species. They were social creatures who formed bonds of loyalty that transcended logic. And they had a trait that no other species possessed in quite the same way. They were stubborn to the point of irrationality, refusing to accept defeat even when victory was impossible. The void would not have broken them, Thane said quietly. It would have made them stronger. That was what worried him most. The communications console suddenly came to life, filling the bridge with a calm, professional voice. It spoke in perfect galactic common, though with an accent that marked it as distinctly human. The voice identified itself as Commander Sarah Chen of the Terran vessel Endurance. She welcomed the diplomatic mission and requested that Hope's Beacon approach the flagship of the fleet for face-to-face negotiations. The envoy ship moved forward, guided by coordinates provided by the human fleet. As they drew closer, the true scale of the human vessels became apparent. The flagship, named Perseverance, was massive beyond comprehension. It was not simply a ship, but a mobile city, capable of housing hundreds of thousands of people. Docking ports lined its hull like windows, and entire sections appeared to be agricultural domes where food could be grown during the long journey through the void. Hope's Beacon was directed to a docking bay near the command section. As the airlock cycled and the ambassadors prepared to disembark, Thane felt his heart racing. This was the moment that would determine the future of the galaxy. Everything depended on what happened in the next few hours. The docking bay was clean and well-maintained, but it showed the same signs of age and repair as the exterior hull. Human crew members worked efficiently around the bay, their movements precise and practiced. They wore uniforms that were functional rather than decorative, marked with symbols and insignias that Thane recognized from his research. These were military personnel, disciplined and alert. A woman stepped forward to greet them. She was tall for human standards, with dark skin and eyes that held the weight of years beyond her physical age. She introduced herself as Captain Elena Vasquez, commander of the Perseverance and leader of the Exodus fleet's vanguard. Her voice carried authority, but also something else, a deep weariness that came from bearing responsibility for too long. Captain Vasquez welcomed the ambassadors formally, thanking them for having the courage to meet the fleet before it reached inhabited space. She gestured for them to follow her through the ship's corridors. As they walked, Thane observed everything with the careful attention of a researcher. The walls were covered with memorials, names of those who had died during the Exodus, dates marking battles fought and obstacles overcome. There were images too, pictures of Earth before the evacuation, blue oceans and green continents that no longer existed. The humans had carried their memories with them through 8 centuries of darkness. They arrived at a conference room that had been prepared for the negotiations. It was simple but dignified, with a large table and chairs designed to accommodate different species' physiologies. Captain Vasquez took her seat at the head of the table and invited the ambassadors to sit. Other human officers filed in, each taking their position with military precision. However, they were armed, while they were polite and professional. The humans were taking no chances. Captain Vasquez began by explaining what had happened after they left the galaxy. The story she told was one of unimaginable hardship and equally unimaginable determination. The Exodus fleet had ventured into the void beyond the galaxy rim, searching for worlds capable of supporting human life. The journey was supposed to take 50 years. It took 800. The void was not empty as they had hoped. It was filled with dangers that challenged every aspect of human survival. Spatial anomalies that could tear ships apart, radiation storms that could kill entire crews, resource scarcity that forced impossible choices about who would eat and who would not, and creatures, things that lived in the darkness between galaxies, beings of energy and malice that attacked anything that entered their territory. The first century was the hardest. Humanity lost 60% of its population to starvation, disease, and the creatures that hunted them through the void. Ships were destroyed. Colonies that tried to settle on marginal worlds failed catastrophically. Entire generations were born, lived, and died without ever seeing a habitable planet. There were moments when the fleet's leaders seriously considered turning back, returning to the galaxy they had left, even if it meant begging for sanctuary from civilizations that might have replaced them. But they did not turn back. Instead, they adapted. Human scientists developed new technologies born from desperation. They learned to extract resources from nebulae and dead stars. They created artificial environments that could sustain life indefinitely. They built weapons capable of fighting the void creatures. And most importantly, they changed themselves. Captain Vasquez paused here, her expression becoming difficult to read. She explained that humanity had been forced to evolve in ways that went beyond natural selection. Genetic modifications, cybernetic enhancements, neural augmentations that improved coordination and communication across the fleet. The humans who were returning were not quite the same species that had left. They were stronger, faster, more resistant to radiation and disease. They could survive in environments that would kill the humans of old. But they were still human, the captain insisted. They still valued the same things their ancestors had valued: family, loyalty, freedom, the right to exist without being subjugated by others. They had not survived the void only to become conquerors or tyrants. They wanted to come home, to rebuild their connection to the galaxy, to share what they had learned during their long exile.
Ambassador Lyric spoke carefully, asking the question that everyone in the room was thinking. What did humanity want from the current galactic civilizations? What would this return actually mean for the species that now occupied the spaces humanity had left behind? Captain Vasquez's answer was direct. Humanity wanted three things. First, recognition of their right to exist in the galaxy they had left, including restoration of access to the Sol system and other original human territories. Second, peaceful coexistence with the civilizations that had risen during their absence, with mutual respect and fair treatment under galactic law. And third, and most important, the freedom never again to be forced to flee their homes. Captain Vasquez leaned forward, her eyes intense. She spoke of the horror humanity had experienced watching their son die, knowing they could do nothing to stop it, having to choose who would be saved and who would be left behind. That trauma had shaped human consciousness for 8 centuries. They would not, could not allow themselves to be made vulnerable like that again. If the galaxy welcomed them as equals, humanity would be the most loyal and valuable ally any civilization could ask for. But if the galaxy tried to subjugate them, to take advantage of their refugee status, to treat them as lesser beings, then the galaxy would discover that 800 years of surviving the impossible made humanity very difficult to defeat. The room fell silent. The threat was not hidden, but neither was it delivered with hostility. It was simply a statement of fact. Humanity had survived the void. They could survive anything, the galaxy.
Commander Varkas's representative, a Corthan officer named Drex, who had accompanied the mission against Lyrix's wishes, stood abruptly. He demanded to know the size of humanity's military forces, the capabilities of their weapons, the locations of their new colonies. His tone was aggressive, barely masking the Corthan Empire's desire to assess humanity as either a resource to exploit or a threat to eliminate. Captain Vasquez regarded Drex with cold eyes. She answered that humanity's military strength was sufficient to defend themselves, and that they had no intention of providing detailed intelligence to potential enemies. If the Corthan Empire approached humanity with hostile intent, they would discover the answers to those questions the hard way. She suggested Drex consider carefully whether his empire really wanted to test the combat capabilities of a species that had fought void creatures for 8 centuries. Drex bristled with anger, but Lyrix quickly intervened, smoothly redirecting the conversation back to diplomatic matters. She proposed that humanity send representatives to the Grand Assembly to formally present their case to all the civilizations of the galaxy. A period of negotiation could determine how humanity's return would be integrated into the current galactic order, ensuring that all parties' concerns were addressed fairly. The captain considered this proposal. She consulted quietly with her officers, their conversation too low for the translators to pick up clearly. Finally, she agreed. Humanity would send delegates to the Grand Assembly, but the fleet would continue its approach to the galaxy. They would stop at the rim and wait for negotiations to conclude, but they would not retreat. After 800 years, humanity was done running. As the meeting concluded, Thane found himself alone with Captain Vasquez for a moment. He could not contain his researcher's curiosity. He asked her what it had been like, those 8 centuries in the void, what kept humanity going when death seemed inevitable at every turn. The captain smiled, and, for the first time, Thane saw warmth in her expression. She told him about the children born in the fleet, who had never known Earth but carried its memory in their hearts. She told him about the volunteers who had given their lives to protect others, who had walked into radiation-filled areas or fought void creatures knowing they would not survive. She told him about the artists who created beauty in the darkness, the teachers who ensured knowledge was never lost, the engineers who refused to give up even when the ships were falling apart around them. Humanity survived, she said, because they had something worth surviving for, each other. The captain placed a hand on Thane's shoulder, the gesture surprisingly gentle for a warrior who had commanded fleets through the void. She told him that she hoped the galaxy would accept humanity's return peacefully, because humans made much better friends than enemies. They remembered kindness for generations, but they also never forgot betrayal. The ambassadors returned to Hope's beacon and began the journey back to Axis Prime. Behind them, the human fleet continued its steady advance toward the galaxy's edge. Thane spent the journey compiling his observations, preparing his report for the Grand Assembly. He knew that what he said in the coming days would help determine whether humanity's return led to a new era of cooperation or a catastrophic war. The Grand Assembly convened 3 days later. The chamber was packed, not just with delegates, but with observers from every major civilization. The entire galaxy watched as Lyrax presented the findings from First Contact. She spoke of humanity's trials, their transformation, their desire for peace, and their capability for war. She argued passionately for accepting humanity's return, for welcoming them as equals rather than treating them as threats. But not everyone was convinced. The Korthan Empire's delegate argued that humanity was too dangerous, too changed from their time in the void. They proposed quarantine, restricting humanity to a small section of space where they could be monitored and controlled. Other civilizations, frightened by the legends and the reality of human military power, supported this position. The debate raged for hours. Thane watched from the gallery, his heart heavy with worry. He could see the assembly splitting into factions, some advocating for peace, others for containment, still others for preemptive military action. The galaxy was tearing itself apart before humanity had even fully returned. Then something unexpected happened. A new signal arrived, broadcast directly into the assembly chamber. It came from the human fleet, but not from Captain Vasquez. This was a different voice, older, carrying an authority that silenced the entire room. The speaker identified herself as Admiral Rebecca Torres, the supreme commander of all human forces, the leader who had guided humanity through 8 centuries of exile. The Admiral's message was brief but powerful. She thanked the galaxy for considering humanity's return. She acknowledged the fear that many civilizations felt and validated their concerns. But she also reminded them of something important. Humanity left this galaxy because they had no choice, not because they wanted to. They had spent 800 years dreaming of home, teaching their children about the stars they came from, keeping alive the hope that one day they would return. Now that day had arrived, and humanity would not be denied. However, the Admiral continued, humanity understood that they could not simply demand acceptance. They would prove themselves worthy of returning. The human fleet would remain at the galactic rim for 1 full standard year, during which time humanity would share their technology, their knowledge, their resources with any civilization that approached them peacefully. They would demonstrate through actions, not just words, that they sought cooperation rather than domination. But if after that year, the galaxy still rejected them, if civilizations tried to deny humanity the right to exist in their ancestral home, then humanity would take what was rightfully theirs. The Admiral's voice hardened as she delivered the final warning. They had survived the void. They had fought creatures of nightmare and won. They had endured 800 years of exile with their humanity intact. They would not surrender now. Not to fear, not to prejudice, not to any force in the galaxy. The message ended. The assembly chamber sat in stunned silence. Then, slowly, delegates began to speak. The tone had changed. There was still fear, still uncertainty, but also something new, respect. Humanity had not threatened immediate war. They had offered compromise, a chance to prove themselves, a pathway to peaceful integration. But they had also made clear that peace was a choice, not a certainty. Over the following weeks, the galaxy began to respond. Some civilizations sent ships to meet the human fleet, tentatively establishing contact, beginning trade and cultural exchange. Others maintained distance, watching and waiting to see what would happen. The Korthan Empire, predictably, began mobilizing military forces, though they stopped short of actual aggression. Thane was appointed as the primary liaison between humanity and the Grand Assembly. He traveled regularly to the human fleet, meeting with their leaders, learning about their society, helping to bridge the gap between the species that had stayed and the species that had returned. With each visit, his respect for humanity grew. They were not perfect, they had flaws and conflicts just like any other species, but they possessed something remarkable, an unbreakable will to survive, and a deep loyalty to those they considered their own. 6 months into the waiting period, an incident occurred that would define humanity's relationship with the galaxy. A Corthan battle group, acting without official sanction, attacked a human exploration vessel that had ventured slightly beyond the agreed-upon boundaries. The attack was brutal and unprovoked, clearly intended to test human responses and demonstrate Corthan military superiority. The response was swift and devastating. Human warships appeared within hours, overwhelming the Corthan battle group with tactics and technology that left the aggressors helpless. But instead of destroying the Corthan vessels, they disabled them, captured the crews, and delivered them unharmed to the nearest Grand Assembly station, along with complete tactical recordings of the engagement. The message was clear. Humanity could defend themselves with lethal effectiveness, but they chose restraint. They would not start wars, but they would finish them. The Corthan Empire, humiliated by the defeat and the mercy shown to their forces, withdrew from the border regions and ceased hostile actions. As the one-year waiting period drew to a close, the Grand Assembly took a final vote. The result was overwhelming. Humanity would be welcomed back into the galaxy as full members of the galactic community, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. On the day the vote was announced, the human fleet finally crossed back into the galaxy proper. They did not come as conquerors or refugees, but as returning children who had grown strong in their absence. Captain Vasquez sent a message to Thane personally, thanking him for his efforts to bridge the divide between species. She told him that humanity would remember his kindness and that the bonds forged during this difficult time would last for generations. Thane watched from Axis Prime as the human ships passed by the station, beginning their long journey toward the Sol system and Earth. The planet itself was dead, its sun having completed its fatal expansion centuries ago, but the humans intended to build a memorial there, a monument to what they had lost and what they had survived. As the last ships of the Exodus fleet disappeared into the distance, Thane reflected on everything that had happened. The galaxy had been given a rare gift, the chance to witness the return of legends, to see firsthand what humanity truly meant.